the hierarchy of the underworld, and how to create your own spiritual practice on today's Oblyron Spirituality. Greetings everyone, I am Oblyron, Lord of the Underworld and Magister of the Cube. Thank you for joining me on today's episode where we are going to talk about how to create our own spiritual practices based off of what we've experienced and what we've studied, and also the hierarchy and structure of the underworld which was revealed to me by Spirit. So today is an Oblyron Origins video, and with those Origins video, I am pretty much giving my most direct revelations from Spirit, my personal experiences and how I've arrived at these sort of conclusions or revelations, whatever you want to call it. And what I realized is that many of the things that I experienced, they were also experienced by Carl Jung, and apparently they were experienced by many people throughout history. When Carl Jung had his nervous breakdown and he basically, put all the archetypes that he discovered in the Red Book, he came across 72 different archetypes. It's the same number that is also represented by the Goetia. So here we have, the number 72, entities revolving around 72, or 72 entities, 72 archetypes. And, that there's connections between the two because we are all connected as human beings. We are all connected energetically, and so on and so forth. So when I had my spiritual experience, particularly with the shadow, the Goetia also came to me as well. For a while, I was wearing on my right hand, on my middle finger, I've been wearing an iron band for a long time, an unenclosed iron band. And that was also, it was representative not only of, let's say, a good luck ring, but it also satisfies one of the doshas in Hinduism. There was a Saturnian, I don't know the exact terminology. I wish I knew it better. If someone knows, please put it in the comments. But pretty much, an unenclosed iron band is common amongst many different cultures. So not only do we have these symbols of archetypes, but we also have iron bands and, these things which sort of transcend space and time. The iron band is significant because it was also an iron band which King Solomon used to command the demon Asmodeus to build the Temple of Solomon. And I think it's interesting because I also wear a Metatron cube, and if you look close at the Metatron cube, it also looks like a Star of David. I think it's very interesting that, both these elements sort of came into my life with no connection or even previous knowledge. So again, as I've said in some of my previous videos, as in, let's say with how I claimed the Underworld throne, a lot of these events, they took place over years. So it's not like I was sitting down kind of thinking about these things, kind of forcing these things into being. This is just all the collection of my experience. And what I believe is that as I started to study things more, as I started to study the components that make up spirituality, that was when many of the revelations started to happen. And I think it's also an ability that's available to all of us. So this is something which I don't believe is unique to me. Much as in the way when we let's say, study a musical instrument and we break things down into their parts. We learn chords, we learn scales, and then we put it all together to learn songs. It's the same thing that happens in spirituality. We learn concepts, we learn archetypes, we learn various things, and then at some point, they kind of take on a life of their own. And that's when we really start to experience our own personal experience, our own personal spiritual experience. What I found is that I can't really adopt anything else. I can't really call myself anything else. I don't even know if I call myself a spiritualist, but whatever it is, so many things have happened. I can't necessarily just, let's say, read the Bible and accept it as my truth, because my truth has come to me in other ways. Same thing with the Bhagavad Gita, same thing with, even the Secret Teachings of All Ages. All these spiritual manuals and pamphlets, once your own spiritual identity starts to form, on one hand you understand them, but on another hand you also can't relate to them because your practice is already flowing through you. So I'm going to dive into a little bit of how things are structured and how I came to these revelations, and hopefully point out ways in which you can also learn how to develop your own spiritual practice. So let's start at the very beginning, which is a very good place to start. My higher self essentially began in the light, began as a seraphim of light, and my higher self chose to descend into shadow. This is unlike, let's say, the Christian tradition, where, let's say, the Lucifer was cast into hell. My higher self actually chose to go to hell. My higher self chose to serve in the shadow. And I think that makes a completely different perspective on how I view the shadow and how I view darkness, because my higher self chose to be there. It's not a punishment. It's not something to feel bad about or to be reprimanded over. This was my higher self's destiny. And again, if you don't know, my higher self is not from around here, so he kind of doesn't follow the same rules of the game. And that's another thing too, is in my particular spiritual practice, it's more of an amalgam of what I've learned, as opposed to adopting any one practice. So you may see some familiar names, but they don't quite fit within the same context of the original practice that they came from. I've adopted them into my own, and if we go by the concept of archetypes, well, even these beings are nameless in themselves. Like, let's say, for example, Hecate. There is what we associate as being the goddess Hecate, but there is also the energy which Hecate represents. And this is very common in, let's say, Thoughtforms and egregores, which, one being can represent so many energetic beings behind them. They are the symbol, they are the token of that energetic thought form. So, going back, again, my higher self is a seraphim of light, chose to serve in darkness. Also, yes, my higher self does choose to rule the underworld, but again, it's not from a position of being punished. If we go back to the 5 layers of the underworld, what I stated was, my particular version of the underworld is not necessarily evil. It's more like how the ancient Greeks viewed the underworld. They respected the underworld, and they still feared the underworld because it represented death but there was not this sort of negative connotation as, let's say, the Christian hell. But my particular underworld is actually a combination of both, because again, it serves as an intermediary plane, but also it acts as a prison. And within that prison realm of the underworld, you could classify it as hell. You could classify it as a place of punishment, as a place of repentance, and all those things. But again, it's not because a demon forced you there, it's because we put ourselves there. That's another different concept. From my perspective, the underworld is more of like, let's say, in Game of Thrones, being a watcher on the wall. The underworld is sort of the last stop before you go to the void consciousness of God, before you go to the shadow consciousness of God. Because again, the deepest layer of the underworld is the shadow aspect of God. It's the void aspect of God. Now, so we have the void aspect of God, and if we were to go in, let's say, the structures of power, the hierarchy of power of how the underworld is structured, we have God being the most powerful, the shadow aspect of God, the negative aspect of God, however you want to call it, the dark aspect. That is the most powerful. And right after that would be beings like my higher self. My higher self is a being of absolute destruction, and he's not the first of these type of archetypes to be invented, obviously, because throughout the Judeo-Christian tradition we have that same energy being called Abaddon. In the Greek world we have that same energy being called Apollyon. And all throughout human civilization we have these archetypes of destruction. So here we have, at the most powerful level of the underworld, we have God being the most powerful, and then we have the aspects of destruction. So whether you call it Oblyron or Apollyon or Abaddon, whatever it is, that is the being which comes after God. So this is also different from the Gnostic interpretation too, where, let's say, a being like Yaldabaoth thinks he's God, as opposed to my higher self knowing that he's not God. He knows he's very strong, but he knows he's not God. And I think that is really sort of the key element here, is you have an underworld lord, an underworld being who serves God first. It's kind of an odd concept, but really, in many of the spiritual practices that we see, I think we see very much the same concept. With Lucifer being the most beautiful angel, at one point he did serve God. And so, does Lucifer still serve God in hell? That's a very interesting question. If God is all-knowing and omnipotent, then Lucifer should essentially be a puppet of God. Anyways, that's a discussion for another time. So anyways, we have these beings of destruction which are right before God. And the whole reason is because destruction leads to the void. Destruction is the only thing which keeps the rest of the structure, keeps the rest of the hierarchy in place. Without a being who could essentially destroy anything else, without someone like that in place, well, the whole system kind of goes haywire. And so again, it's we're talking about archetypal concepts too. So this is also, we may be talking about beings, we may be talking about energies, but they also represent bigger concepts. So we have destruction right after God, and then right after that we have essentially my higher self's 7 chakras. And his particular chakras, since he is associated with the underworld, his 7 chakras are actually the 7 demons of sin. So essentially, when I was talking about how demons can possess the chakras, I was pretty much talking about my higher self's chakras. And if you look at it from an esoteric standpoint, okay, so you have God, then you have destruction, and then you have sin after that. And just as light fractures into 7 rays of light, the shadow also fractures into 7, I guess you could call them rays of the shadow. They fracture into the sins of the shadow. After the chakras, that's where we have the Goetia. And the Goetia, the 72 Goetia, the Goetia essentially report to the chakras, or they report to the generals. And then the generals report to my higher self. So it creates this sort of chain of command in which we ultimately have sort of, let's say, lesser motivations which lead to sin, which lead to destruction, which lead to God. That is essentially the esoteric flowchart of that diagram. And then, of course, after the Goetia, there are all the legions of the shadow that they command as well, and those legions report to the Goetia. So essentially, the underworld that my higher self has constructed involves, again, the 7 demons, the 7 princes of hell from Christianity. It also involves the Goetia and all of their legions. But then there's also Hecate, who reports directly to my higher self, and she fulfills different roles throughout the underworld. She's very much the same Hecate as everyone else knows her by. So those are essentially all the spirits in my underworld, and they all come together and they work to maintain the 5 levels of the underworld. They all fulfill specific roles and functions across all the various layers, and they also act on my behalf when needed, or sometimes they just act on their own. Now, one thing which is a little bit different in my spiritual practice is the shadow aspect of God sometimes goes on the offense. Like I said, in my version of the underworld, we are kind of like watchers on the wall. Well, what happens when the White Walkers come? Well, everyone has to arm themselves. Everyone has to prepare for battle. So what happens when the shadow aspect of God moves? Well, we have to prepare for battle too. And that's part of the reason why the underworld in my spiritual practice is associated with destruction. That's why there is so much power in the underworld. It's basically the shadow is armed for a reason. The shadow has these abilities for a reason, and it's essentially to hold off or stave off the shadow aspect of God. Now, here's where things also change a little bit too, is that if the battle goes really bad, my higher self has the ability to conscript from the light to be able to fight in the shadow. So, yeah, anyone who's chilling on the Elysian Fields or Cloud 9 or whatever, guess what? When things go bad and you're called, well, you don't have a get out of hell free card is basically what I'm trying to say. When things go bad, we all do our part to essentially keep existence going. And then, of course, even if we fail, well, it really doesn't matter, because we never go anywhere anyways. we just repeat the same cycles. So it makes me wonder if it's even worth it to conscript for the shadow when things get really bad. So again, the underworld is not what we think it is. Demons aren't what we think they are. It took me a long time to come to terms and make peace with the fact that everything in my spiritual teachings has taught me that, my higher self is a demon. But as I've really come to terms with it and really started to study the dynamics of why things are the way they are, I actually started to feel a bit proud that I am who I am. I started to realize the function that I serve and the function that the shadow really should serve. The shadow should not be to inflict further punishment. The shadow should be about exploring really what is the darkest parts within us. So have you experienced any spiritual revelations? If you have, feel free to leave a comment down below and let us all know. And also, if you happen to resonate with today's message, then don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. Thanks again for joining, and love and light and wisdom and shadow. And now we shall close with the chant of Oblyron. Amde sote, amde Oblyron, amde sote, amde Oblyron.